Hey Spookies, Shauna here. Before we get into tonight's episode, I do want to give a disclaimer that there is topics that involve violence towards children. I won't be going into deep detail, but there will be listener discretion advised. Also, I did my best on the pronunciation of some of the names, so please be kind and understand that I'm just a Canadian girl trying to say the words the best way she can. So don't come for me if I make a mistake, but I promise, really hard to pronounce them right. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Bye-bye. The kitchen was small and full of people. A fire had been lit on the other side of the room, and she lay in a bed in the corner. A thin woman, 26 years of age, with dark hair and a sharp tongue, but she had been ill for 9 days total, with what we would likely have called today bronchitis, or perhaps pneumonia, but we can't be sure. Her name was Bridget Cleary, and the man standing above her with a wooden spoon full of boiled herbs was her husband Michael. The others were her father, her aunt, her cousins, and 2 neighbors, and they were all holding her down. Michael asked her 3 times, "Are you Bridget Cleary, the wife of Michael Cleary? In the name of God." He needed her to say it 3 times. That was the rule. She did answer, but as he would state later, it wasn't in her voice. It wasn't loud enough. It wasn't right. So, he forced the herbs into her mouth and held a lamp close to her face. And again, he asked her the same question. "Are you Bridget Cleary, the wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" And when she wouldn't answer the way he had wanted her to, when she began to cry, she began to beg for him to stop, he doused her nightdress in lamp oil, and he set her on fire. Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, spooky souls, to a brand new episode of Let's Talk Spooky. I am your host, Shauna, and I'm so happy you're here tonight to join me on this journey into the forest. I want to do a quick disclaimer before we head into today's episode. I have got so many comments wondering if this is narrated by an AI, and I don't know what my voice sounds like that makes it sound AI, but I can promise you wholeheartedly I am a very real person. Anyway, rest assured, 100% Canadian, 100% flesh and blood, and 100% spooky. This is an episode that has been requested time and time again, and I wanted to do it around spring because there's just something about the earth waking up that reminds you that there's a little bit of magic deep within our world. And I don't know about you, when I think nature and forests and magic, I think about the Fae. So tonight, we're going to venture into the world of the fairies. So I hope you're ready, because some of these stories might surprise you, because they're way more fact than they are fiction. If you're just stumbling upon this podcast and you have no idea what to expect, well, welcome. Here at Let's Talk Spooky, we are a community of creepy loving people, and we dive into the far corners of everything dark and spooky. So if that's your vibe, remember after you listen to this episode to leave a review, say hi in the comments, and hit that follow button so that you don't miss an episode. So come along with me as we explore the world of the fairies. Make sure that you don't step off the path and try to decide between what is fact and what is fiction. Light that candle, get yourself cozy, and let's talk spooky. Now, if you haven't heard Bridget Cleary's story before, it might sound fictional. You might be thinking, it's just another folktale told to scare people. But this is in fact an actual case. On March 15th, 1895, in Dublin, Ireland, a whitewashed cottage stood at the end of a road. Inside, it held 8 people, and none of them attempted to stop what was about to happen. Each one believed that what they were seeing was real. They believed that the woman in the bed was no longer Michael Cleary's wife, for the fairies had taken her. And by burning what was in that bed, well, that's just what needed to be done. You see, it was a changeling. In order to get rid of a changeling, there was particular things that needed to be done. And Michael Cleary was ready to do whatever it took to get his wife back. Michael Cleary was a copper by trade and a barrel maker. At the age of 29, he was well-spoken and well thought of in the village. And the neighbors who had held her down were not strangers either. They were part of her family. They were part of her community. In the days before the burning, Michael carried Bridget through the cottage on his shoulders, demanding that the fairies bring her back. He threw urine on her. He pressed hot pokers into her face. He asked her over and over to say the incantation, "Are you Bridget Cleary, in the name of God?" And you might be thinking, WTF at this moment. What in the hell is this guy thinking? But he truly believed. He was genuinely trying to help his wife. And in his eyes, he was doing the right thing. That the real Bridget had been stolen, and this was the only way to get his wife back. He believed that if he could drive the changeling out of her body, that the real Bridget would return. She would come back to him on a white horse on the 3rd night of the changeling's death. For 3 nights after the burning, he stood at the threshold of his door, black-handled knife in hand, waiting for her. But she never came. She was buried in what was left of her body in a shallow grave near a bog on the edge of the property. A search party did later find her, and the Crown tried Michael for murder. The jury convicted him of manslaughter, and he served 15 years. The newspaper called it the last witch burning in Ireland. But that wasn't quite right. Because if you remember, they never accused Bridget Cleary of being a witch. They accused her of being a changeling. Before we learn about the final bits of Bridget's story, I want to backtrack a bit. And I want to talk about what a fairy truly is. Because it does vary across cultures. We'll stay in Ireland for a moment, because the Irish's accounts of fairies is so well documented that I think it would give the best grasp onto what a fairy truly is. And I think also we owe it to Bridget Cleary to understand what kind of depth of belief made her death possible. So what is an Irish fairy? Well, let's start with what it's not. It's not a small, cute creature with wings that sprinkles fairy dust all over the place. And if you're thinking Tinkerbell, essentially that's what it's not. Irish fairies look, in most accounts, like a person. Sometimes they're tall, often they're beautiful, and sometimes they might even feel like someone you would recognize. A stranger you might meet on a back road, a young woman dancing at the edge of a field, a man on a fine horse. But they generally don't stick around. They usually disappear, either into the woods, into the mist, or altogether seemingly into thin air. But the Irish believed that their world ran adjacent to ours, that sometimes they could touch between worlds, but never exist completely. And the Irish had a word for these creatures, ish she, which means people of the mound. But even that name wasn't used as frequently as, say, the good people, or the other crowd, or themselves. Because the name was just as important as the respect to these creatures. You called them good people not because you believed they were good, but because you didn't want them catching you calling them anything else. But where did they come from? Honestly, the Irish can't really agree on this. There are a number of different stories that weave into each other. In the oldest versions of this story, the Ashi were defeated by pre-Christian gods in Ireland, a divine race called the Tuatha De Danann, who once ruled the land. When the human ancestors of modern Ireland sailed and conquered the land, the gods lost. And they believed that they didn't leave completely. They just disappeared from sight. They might have gone down into underground cities beneath the surface of Ireland itself. But the stories do say that these creatures are older than language itself, older than church bells, and they're still down there, still listening, waiting for their opportunity to return. The second story is a little bit different. It came alongside Christianity, and it said that the fairies were fallen angels. Angels who, when Lucifer rebelled, decided not to pick sides. They were neither loyal to heaven or hell, but they decided in their case to meet halfway, to be in the in-between space, to the hills, to the wells, to the mist at the edge of a field, and there they remained as watchful guardians. The third story, though, this one's a little darker. This one states that they were the spirits of unbaptized children lost to disease, and that they could not go to a Christian afterlife. So they became part of the bog instead. And they're seen moving along as lights in the marsh, not as ghosts, but as spirits that can do harm if they so wish to. Now, these are three very different stories, and the Irish don't necessarily pick between which one is the true fairy origin story. And that's not really what matters. It's that the fairies are there, and that the Irish live among them. Across Ireland, you can see plain as day fairy roads. They are circular green hills, rings of earth and stone. Sometimes they're a single ancient hawthorn tree that grows straight in the middle. And these are all fairy forts. Archaeologists will tell you that they're simply ruins of a medieval ring fort that are from somewhere around the Iron Age of early Christianity. But the people who live in Ireland, who farmed, who've buried their dead, folklorists and all, will tell you that these are doorways, places where the underground world of the fairies touches the surface of ours. And on certain nights, they come out to play. In rural Ireland, to this day in 2026, there are still people who plow around fairy forts rather than go through them, who will leave lone hawthorns standing in the middle of a field rather than cut it down, who, when asked why, simply shrug. They don't necessarily say they believe in all of that, but they say their grandmother did, and the grandmother before her. And grandma's not a fool, so they don't intend to be either. Now, I want to touch on the rules because if you visit Ireland, maybe, and you come across one of these locations, I want you to be prepared. Rules are also how we live, how we work, and how we understand the things that came before us. So it's important that they stand alongside everything we do. But the Irish rules are very specific. They are universally understood from generation to generation, and they are absolute. You do not say their true name. You use soft names, such as good people, the gentle, themselves, because to call a fairy by name can be something truly dangerous. You cannot accept food from a fairy. If you sit at a fairy table and you eat fairy bread, you're never coming home. Or if you did, hundreds of years will pass, and everybody who you loved, who you shared life with, will be underground by the time you return. To thank a fairy is to imply that they are beneath you and that they had performed a service, and they don't like that. If they leave something for you on a saucer, by your bedside, at your hearth, you are to say nothing and simply accept. This next one I found interesting because this part of a role is not just seen in Ireland, and it's actually seen in a number of different cultures across the world. And we're going to do a full episode on this in the future, but don't whistle at night. It's crazy how many times not to whistle at night comes up in a number of different types of folklore, not just for fairy folklore, but we see it in the Appalachians, we see it across indigenous tribes, and I think it's fascinating how this don't whistle at night crossover happens over and over again. Never cut down a hawthorn tree, but one of the biggest, I think, to make point of is that you should always watch your children, because a human child is at most risk to being taken by the fairies. And every parent of Ireland feared this most, feared it more than fever, more than famine, was that their human child would be claimed by the fairies. And the lore said that the fairy would slip into your house late at night, they would lift a healthy infant out of its cradle, and they would place one of their own children. Generally, it would be a sickly fairy, a dying fairy, or sometimes it would just be a piece of carved wood, glamored to look like a baby. The thing would be left in the cradle, and you would find it the next morning, and it would take a little while, perhaps, before you would notice that it is no longer your infant. They had a name for this, the changeling. And the changeling would never grow. It wouldn't feed like a normal child would. It would cry strangely. It would look you directly into your eyes, as if its soul was much older. But there were tests for this. To know for certain if you had a changeling, one of the most famous tests was the eggshell test. You put an empty eggshell over the fire and pretend to brew beer in them. If the baby in the cradle sat up and spoke to you, it was said to have an old man's voice. I have lived 1,000 years, and I have never seen ale brewed in an eggshell. If it said this, you had your answer. And there are some cures, ways that you can drive a changeling out, per se, and force the fairies to give your real child back. If you hold the changeling near a fire, it is supposed to drive the fairy soul out. If it's laid on a hot iron shovel, or if you bathe it in water laced in foxglove, a plant that can offer medicinal purposes or be lethal in large doses. If you force the strange herb down the changeling's throat, it is said the fairy will flee, and in the morning, your real child will be back in its cradle. Now, unfortunately, you can probably guess how often that these remedies worked. Never. Why would they? Because truly, a child never left. The child was simply sick, potentially developmentally disabled. It could have been dying from over the 100 ordinary 19th century afflictions. Getting tortured by people who loved them most, well, that was heartbreaking. And I want to stress how much of this wasn't just legend or lore, that there's real documented cases of individuals dealing with changelings. One of them being in Killarney, Curry in 1826. And it's of an elderly woman named Anne Roach, who believed her grandson Michael was possessed by a changeling. Now, Michael couldn't stand, he couldn't walk, and he couldn't speak. And his grandmother believed that this affliction that he had was fairy struck, that it was something that with old medicine she could cure. So, her prescription for this was river water. And for 3 mornings in a row, Roach and another woman, Mary Clifford, immersed Michael into the cold water. But on the 3rd morning, something went wrong. Roach held him under a little too long, and he drowned. Mary Clifford was terrified, and she asked Anne how she could ever hope to get in God's good graces after this. But Roach's answer was interesting. And this comes directly from transcribed court cases. And she stated that it was not her sin, but that of her grandmother passed down before her. And she was doing the boy a service. You see, her intent was not to kill the child. And she never believed she did. Instead, she truly believed she killed the fairy within it. And here's the part that may or may not shock you. The jury believed her. Anne Roach was acquitted on all charges, and she got to go home. She had killed her 4-year-old grandson, and she got to go home because she believed he was a fairy. I'm just going to let that sink in there for a second. 2 women in Tipperary County in May of 1884, 11 years before Bridget Cleary died in the same town. Anastasia Brooks and Ellen Cushion entered the home of a neighbor while the mother was out. There, they stripped her 3-year-old son, Philip Dillon, naked. Philip couldn't use his limbs, and thinking that they could help him, they placed the child on an iron shovel and held it over the hot fire. A standard folk method in part of Ireland for driving the changeling out of children. The boy was so badly burned that it said parts of his skin were peeled off when the shovel was removed. The case made the Daily Telegraph, and on the 19th of May, the 2 women were arrested and led through the streets. Neighbors hooted and cheered, but it's hard to say whether or not they cheered for the women because they hurt the child or because they were caught. And there's more, because of course there is. There have been children burned in 1870s, again in the 1890s. There have been children documented to be killed by foxglove, bathed by their parents to administer a remedy to drive out the fairies. There was a 6-year-old girl named Mary Ann Kelly around the 1850s who was given foxglove and verbena and left exposed naked to the elements, to which she later died of exposure. Then there was Patsy Doyle, an epileptic boy killed by his own mother with a hatchet because she tried everything to drive the fairy out and nothing worked. So the next best thing was to cut the fairy out of her son. So you can see why, by the time Michael Cleary stood with his oil lamp over his sick wife in the 1890s, this wasn't just a freak occurrence. This was the very next chapter in a record that ran the length of the 19th century. He was, like many others, reaching for a ritual to save someone he believed was no longer the person he loved. He was reaching for a ritual his neighbors, his ancestors, and generations before him had reached for. When illness could not be explained, it must have been the fairies. And the heartbreak, the very real heartbreak of this, is that there was no changeling. And the family's cruelty was just that. Convinced in absolute that the person they were hurting was not the person that they loved, but a creature that they just couldn't explain. Ireland isn't the only place that holds a deep lore around fairies. I want to take you across the North Atlantic Ocean to Iceland. And the Icelandic people call the fairies hudafolk, which essentially means hidden people. They believe that they live in the rocks, especially large boulders that are scattered across the volcanic landscape. And they look like us. They dress like us. They live among the stone, but they exist in the same plane. And they don't appreciate being disturbed. So in December 2013, when an Icelandic road crew wanted to put a highway from one peninsula to the next, well, people had something to say about it. You see, the route ran through a 30-ton boulder, which the locals believe was an elfster. And yes, that is a very recognized vocation in Iceland. It was identified as an elf church, and the environmental group called Friends of Lava sat in front of the bulldozer and filed a suit with the Icelandic Supreme Court. Believe it or not, the Supreme Court took this case very seriously, and the construction was halted. Eventually, road administration brought in a psychic who then stated that she could communicate with the creatures in this boulder. And the boulder was agreed to be moved carefully to a new location. And this was in 2013. Surveys done in the early 2000s have found that more than half of Icelanders would not flatly deny the existence of the hudafolk. They weren't sure 100% if they could prove they existed, but they never fully denied it. It's the same logic as the Irish farmers plowing around rifts in their fields, avoiding stone mounds, keeping hawthorn trees exactly where they were planted. Because the land goes back thousands of years before we ever stepped foot upon it. So is it wrong to state that maybe there is something that we just don't understand? Something more powerful than we are? Something that the people can sense for generations. The Welsh had their own version of what they believed the fairies might be, and they called them Tylwyth Teg, or the Fair Family. But they also had another name for them. They also called them Yamamato, which essentially translates to Mother's Blessing. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. And recall previously in the episode when we talked about how the Irish called the fairies the good people. Not because they were essentially good, but because they believed that if they disrespected them, bad things might happen. Well, this is the same kind of logic. They say kind things in order to ensure that if somebody's listening, they're not going to be offended. Folklore's Carol Silver tracks Welsh changeling cases through the 19th century newspaper archives. children dying from foxglove baths their own parents administered to them. Going back to the 1857, same plant, same logic, same heartbreaking details as the cases across the Irish Sea. The Welsh folklorist Elias Owens wrote in 1896 that the practice was embraced by mothers. He wrote that mothers with sickly infants would gladly embrace the idea that their child was a changeling, and that there was potentially an opportunity to get them back. And I get it. As a mother myself, I think that there's part of us that would choose anything that might even give a glimmer of hope to restoring the health of our children. But at what cost? Now, fairies come up in the Philippines as well, and they're called duwata. They live in fig trees or hollowed out chambers inside larger tree trunks. And the Filipino people say that when you walk past one of these old trees, you're supposed to acknowledge the being inside. If you don't, you may come down with an illness, such as fever or worse, or you might not come home at all. There is one more connection I want to make, and that is to the indigenous people of North America. Now, a lot of indigenous cultures have what's called the little people. I'm not going to go into detail about the sacred beliefs around the little people or ritualistic aspects of this, because if you want to know more about that, I think it's really important to contact indigenous storytellers. But I do want to state that this is also something that is very similar to our Celtic fairies. The same underlying belief sits at the bottom of each culture, and it's believed that something lives among us. Whether the creature is of magic, of folklore, or of forgotten time, they are something we can't quite explain. So why does every woods have them? In all honesty, I don't know. Folklorists argue about this all the time. One possibility is, probably the most rational one, is that human beings have the same fundamental experiences. And when we can't make sense of something, we tend to find rationale in the best way we can. We hear a sound in the dark that we can't account for. We lose people to illness that were fine yesterday. We have children who are born unique. And in our minds, we make these stories possible. And these stories have rules, because rules let you feel like you have some power. If you just don't whistle at night, nothing bad will happen. If you leave cream out by the hearth, you will be fine. If you whisper ancient words when you pass by an old tree, maybe your baby will still be in the cradle the next morning. Maybe your wife will stay in her own body. Or maybe you can go home. Another possibility is much older. You see, the fairy faith has many traditions, and it generally resides pre-Christian time and was connected to older gods that we tend to have forgotten over time. And these held powerful representations of the communities to which we built, whether it's good neighbors or hidden people or the ones we don't name. They became something we relied on to understand the things that we couldn't make sense of. And maybe that's the true connection, that the fairy world isn't sparkly little creatures with wings. It's a reminder that every culture holds rules. It sets standards. And it follows an older belief because it's not about fearing imaginary things. It's about understanding that these cultures lived with something. Whether we have a name for it or not is irrelevant. But I think names are important, so I want to say them out loud. Michael Lee, 1826, age 4 years old. Mary Ann Kelly, 1850, 6 years old. Philip Dillon, 1884, 3 years old. The Dongal children, 1870s. Bridget Cleary, 1895, age 26 years old. Yes, the stories of the fairies might seem imaginative. They might seem out of worldly. The names listed above were real people who lost their lives from a belief that was so strong. So next time you find yourself walking past an old tree at dusk, or driving past a green hill that doesn't get plowed, or you're standing in the kitchen with someone you love that doesn't seem like they're themselves lately, I want you to think about Bridget Cleary. I want you to think about that road in Iceland, and maybe, just maybe, leave a little cream out. Just in case. Next week, I want you guys to join me for a little bit deeper of a dive into the fairy world. This time, we're going to look at wildlings and changelings a little bit more closely. We're going to go into a bit more detail about some of the lore around each of them and some documented cases where we're not 100% sure if what happened truly was nefarious or if there was a little magic added in there. So, if you love the fairy stuff or you have a suggestion for an episode that I haven't covered yet, hit that follow, leave a comment, say hi, and join me next week for more fairy scary content. I think that was cute. That was a good one. That's all I have for today's episode. I hope I did the fairies justice and that I won't be having any show up at my door. If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, please take a moment to hit that follow button and leave a review. Not only does doing that help our show grow, but it helps other spooky people like yourself find our channel. And if any of you have an episode request, leave it in the comment below. We love hearing your requests, and we are podcasters of the people, so I always try to fit in your suggestions. And without further ado, I look forward to scaring you in the next episode. Stay curious and stay spooky.